Hey, welcome back, friend. I am so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Let your shoulders drop. Because tonight we're going somewhere that most history books skip entirely. Not to a battlefield, not to a castle, not to a king's great hall hung with banners and torchlight. We're going to a village. A small, ordinary, muddy, breathing, alive medieval village. Somewhere in England, probably. Somewhere around the year 1300, give or take a generation. And we're going to wake up there. Not as a knight, not as a lord, not as anyone remarkable by the standards of their time. We are going to wake up as a villager, and we are going to live the entire day. I want you to understand something before we begin, because it will change how you hear everything that follows. The day we are about to live was not a romantic day. It was not the day from a painting, golden and still, with a peasant posed artfully in a sunlit field. It was a Tuesday. Or something like a Tuesday, a day that had to be gotten through, task by task, from the moment the sky began to lighten until the moment the fire was banked, and the bodies in the house finally went still. And here is what I want to tell you about that day. It will exhaust you just to read about. And somewhere inside that exhaustion, I think you will find something genuinely surprising. Something that feels, against all logic, a little like home. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, the slow, careful kind, where ordinary people in ordinary times become real, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed. I post new sleep-through history videos every week, and there is so much more to explore together. Now let us go back, all the way back. The sky outside is just beginning to go grey. There is a particular quality to the darkness just before dawn that is not quite night anymore. It has lost its depth. The black has softened towards something closer to grey, a grey that has no light in it yet but is no longer entirely without light either. It is the colour of hesitation, of the world gathering itself. In the house where you have woken this morning, that grey is visible only as a thin line around the edges of the door. The door does not fit its frame perfectly. Nothing fits perfectly here. The walls are wattle and daub, a framework of woven hazel sticks plastered over with a mixture of clay, straw and dung, pressed and smoothed and dried into something that, from a distance, resembles a proper wall, and from close up, especially on a morning when the frost has worked into its cracks overnight, resembles something considerably less permanent. The floor beneath you is earth, not stone, not timber, just the earth itself, packed hard by years of feet, strewn with rushes that were fresh once and are not fresh now. You are not alone in this room. You are never alone in this room. There are perhaps 6, 7, 8 other people within arm's reach of you right now, depending on the time of year and the composition of the household. Your family, possibly a servant if the household is prosperous enough, possibly a lodger, in winter quite possibly an animal or two, a goat, a few chickens, because the warmth of animal bodies is not nothing, and the warmth of animal bodies costs nothing beyond the smell, which everyone has long since stopped noticing. The smell. Let me linger here for a moment, because it is one of those things that the paintings and the illuminated manuscripts and the careful reconstructions in museum displays cannot quite convey. The smell of the medieval village house in the morning is the smell of all the previous nights layered over each other. Wood smoke, because the fire has been burning or smouldering all night, and smoke in a house with no chimney, just a hole in the roof, a louver of woven wattle that sometimes keeps the rain out and sometimes does not, disperses slowly, hangs low, settles into fabric and hair and skin, animals, if they have been inside, unwashed bodies, warmly. The particular yeasted smell of bread dough if someone set it to rise the night before, rushes on the floor that hold everything they have absorbed since they were last changed, which was longer ago than you might prefer. This is not a terrible smell, not if you were born into it, not if you have never known anything else. It is simply the smell of habitation, of people living in close proximity to their world and to each other. It is the smell of being inside rather than outside. And in a medieval village in January or February, that distinction matters more than almost any other. Now, the grey line around the door is getting slightly less grey, not yet light, but no longer entirely dark. Someone stirs. In the medieval village, the first person awake in the morning was almost always the woman of the house, Not because this was enforced, not because it was written into any law or any contract, but because the logic of the household made it inevitable. The fire had to be seen to before anything else could begin. Breakfast, and I will tell you shortly what breakfast in a medieval village actually looked like, and it will not be what you're imagining, had to be started before the household could go to work. And the work itself began at first light, which in the depths of a medieval English winter meant around 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and in the height of summer could mean something closer to 4. So the woman is already up. Before you are fully conscious of having woken, she's already moving toward the hearth. The hearth is the centre of this room, not positioned against a wall, the way you might expect, but in the centre, raised slightly from the floor on a flat stone or a bed of packed clay, with the fire burning in the open air of the room itself, the smoke finding its way upward through the louver above. This is not an oversight in the architecture, it is a solution. A hearth in the centre of the room heats the space on all sides. A fire against a wall heats one side and loses the rest. In a room this small, with a population this cold, every degree matters. Let us understand what the woman of the house is doing right now, because it requires real knowledge and real skill, and I want you to see it clearly. She is reading the fire. Not with her eyes exactly. With her hands held near the ash. With the faint smell of it. With the small movements of heat or the absence of them that tell her, in a language she has been learning since she was old enough to crawl toward a hearth, whether the coals buried under the overnight ash are still alive or whether they have gone out. If they are still alive, morning begins one way. If they have gone out, morning begins another way entirely, slower, harder, more anxious. The medieval house had no matches. Let me say that plainly so the full weight of it settles in. No friction matches, no lighter, no gas hob you can turn on with a click. Starting a fire from nothing required flint and steel, 2 tools struck together to throw a spark into a prepared bundle of tinder. Dry moss, dry fungus, fine dry grass, scraps of linen that had been charred in a sealed pot to make what was called char cloth, which caught a spark more readily than raw linen. You struck and you hoped the spark landed in the tinder, and if it did you breathed on it with the particular focused gentleness that comes only with practice, coaxing that tiny ember toward life. On a good morning, with dry tinder and calm air and practised hands, you might have a small flame in 5 minutes. On a cold, damp morning, when the tinder had absorbed overnight moisture, when your fingers were still stiff from the cold, when the children were already making the preliminary sounds of waking and kneading, it could take much, much longer. And in that time, nothing else could happen. You could not make food without heat. You could not warm the room without fire. Everything waited on that first small flame. This is why the great rule of the medieval household, as it was of the colonial household 3 centuries later, was simply, do not let the fire go out. Never let it go out. The overnight banking of coals, the careful covering with ash that preserved a kernel of live heat through the dark hours, was not a comfort. It was a survival strategy. The woman who walked to the hearth in the grey dawn and found her ash still warm was already ahead. The woman who found it cold faced a harder morning than she had planned for. The coals are alive this morning. Let us say that. Let us be kind to ourselves in this small detail. She coaxes them up with a breath, feeds in the smallest and driest of the kindling pieces she had set ready the night before, and within a few minutes the fire is speaking again, small, tentative, growing. Outside, the grey has become something closer to light. The village is beginning to wake. Here is something I want you to understand about the village itself, because it is the context for everything that follows. The medieval English village, and we are imagining the archetypal version here, the most common version, the version that housed the majority of people in England from roughly the 10th century through the 14th, was not a scattering of isolated farms. It was a community, planned and dense and deeply interdependent, in a way that has almost no equivalent in the modern rural landscape. The houses sat along a single main street or clustered around a green, close enough to each other that you could hear your neighbour's children crying through the wall. Beyond the houses, the fields. And here is the part that trips up modern people, because we imagine fields the way we see them today. Individual farms with fences, private land, the owner's name on a deed somewhere. Medieval fields were not like this. In the open field system that governed agriculture across most of medieval England, The village fields were divided into long, thin strips, and every farming family in the village had strips in each of the fields, scattered throughout so that the good ground and the poor ground, the sheltered and the exposed, were shared out more or less fairly. You did not own your strip in the modern sense. You held it in a complex arrangement with the lord of the manor and with your fellow villagers, governed by customs that everyone knew and everyone was expected to follow. This meant that the success of the village's harvest was genuinely collective. If the village managed the fields well, everyone had enough to eat. If they managed them poorly, or if the weather turned, or if disease came through the grain, everyone suffered. There was no individual farmer who could simply decide to do things differently from his neighbours, because his strips ran alongside theirs, and the rotation of crops and the management of the common grazing land required unanimous cooperation. It also meant that the village watched itself. Everyone knew what everyone else was doing. Everyone knew whose fence was falling down, whose cattle had strayed, whose wife had gone to the mill when it was someone else's turn. The community was not a comfort in the abstract sense we might mean the word today. It was an economic and social system, tight-knit because tightness was how it survived. The light is growing. The fire is burning now with more confidence, the wood catching and settling into the particular sound, a soft crackling, almost conversational, that will be the background music of everything that follows. The household is waking up. Let me tell you who is in this house. We will call the man of the house William. This is not a creative choice. William was, for much of the medieval period, the single most common male name in England, a legacy of the conquest that rippled through naming practices for 3 centuries. His wife is Joan. Their children, let us say 3, are perhaps 4, 9, and 12 years old. There may be a servant, a young person from another village family come to work in exchange for food and lodging, a practice so common in medieval England that historians have estimated that at any given moment, roughly a third of young people between the ages of 10 and 20 were living in someone else's household, learning a trade or simply providing labour. There may be in this season William's widowed mother in the corner furthest from the door, where the draught is least. Joan is at the hearth. The 12-year-old is already awake, sitting up from the straw pallet in the corner, looking at the growing light with the particular expression of someone who knows that light means work and is not yet resigned to it. The 4-year-old is still asleep, curled against the warmth of the space where 3 adults were recently lying. William is putting on his shoes. This sounds simple. It is worth pausing over. Shoes in the medieval village were not cheap, not disposable, not easily replaced. A good pair of leather shoes or ankle boots made by a cordwainer, the specialist shoemaker of the medieval period, whose skill was substantial and whose work had to endure the conditions of agricultural labour, represented a meaningful investment for a village family. They were resoled, they were repaired, they were handed down. Walking barefoot was sometimes the reality, especially in summer, and was not considered remarkable. But in January in English mud, the shoes were critical, and putting them on in the morning was an act that deserved its own small ceremony of attention. He laces them in the grey light while Joan stirs the pot that has been sitting covered near the embers all night. The pot. Let us talk about the pot. In most medieval village households there was one main pot. It was iron, or it was ceramic. Pottery so thick and crude by modern standards that it barely resembles what we now call pottery, but functional, heat-resistant, designed to sit in or near coals for hours without cracking. Into this pot went everything that needed cooking. Everything. The medieval housewife did not have a collection of specialised cookware. She had a pot, and perhaps a few ancillary tools, a griddle, a spit, a trivet of some kind to hold the pot above the direct heat, and the entire culinary production of the household flowed from them. What Joan has in the pot this morning is pottage. That word needs a moment, because it is easy to pass over it. Pottage, a word that sounds quaint and historical and slightly forgettable, when in fact it was the central food of most people's lives for most of the medieval period. Pottage was, at its simplest, a grain or vegetable cooked in water until soft. At its more elaborate, on a good day, with more ingredients, in a prosperous household, it might include dried peas or beans, a few scraps of meat or the bone of some previous meat, whatever herbs were to hand from the small garden plot or the dried bundles hanging from the rafters, a handful of oats or barley to thicken it. This morning's pottage is oat-based, Oats and water and a few dried peas that have been soaking since last night in a small wooden bowl set near the embers. She stirs it. The texture is thick, porridge-like, but not quite porridge, something between a soup and a stew. There is no sweetening, there is salt used sparingly. In the medieval village, salt was not nothing. It was traded, stored carefully, measured. The salt used to preserve the pork that got a family through winter was the same salt that could not be wasted on flavouring porridge when it was barely above the threshold of sufficiency. The smell of the cooking pottage joins the smoke and the bodies and the animals in the air of the room. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is warm. It is the smell of breakfast coming. I want to pause here and ask you to do something. I want you to notice how far we are already from the image most of us carry of medieval life. We have not been to a feast. We have not seen a joust. We have not glimpsed a king or a pope or a crusade. We are in a 14-foot by 16-foot room smelling oats cooking, watching a man lace his shoes. And already, if you're paying the right kind of attention, the texture of this world is becoming real in a way that no grand historical narrative quite achieves. The details are where the people are. They always have been. The light outside has shifted from grey to something with actual colour in it. A pale, cold, tentative blue-white that comes in through the door when the 12-year-old opens it to go to the well for water. A blast of cold air enters with the daylight. The fire flinches. Joan moves to shield it automatically, a gesture so practised it happens below the level of thought. The 9-year-old is up now, the 4-year-old is stirring, the day has officially begun. Let me tell you what is about to happen in the next several hours, because the shape of the morning in a medieval village is unlike anything in modern experience, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that follows. The morning was not an easing in. There was no coffee, no scroll of the phone, no slow gathering of oneself over 20 minutes. The morning was immediate. The moment your feet hit the floor, the day had requirements of you, and those requirements were specific, physical, and non-negotiable. The livestock had to be seen to. The animals in the small enclosure behind the house, a few chickens, perhaps a pig, in a better household a cow or a couple of sheep, had not been attended since yesterday evening. A medieval farming household that lost its pig to cold or predation or neglect had lost the most valuable asset it possessed, because the pig was what got the family through winter. The autumn slaughter of the pig, the salting of its flesh, the rendering of its fat, the preservation of every scrap of it. This was the annual act that stood between the family and genuine hunger in February and March. You did not lose the pig. So the first order of morning before breakfast, before anything else, was the animals. The 12-year-old knows this without being told. He's already heading for the enclosure. What strikes me, sitting with this morning, is the density of it. Every action connects to every other action. The fire has to be tended so breakfast can be made. The water has to be drawn so the animals can be watered. The animals have to be seen to so they survive and produce and remain the economic anchor of the household. And all of this has to happen before the main work of the day can even begin. Before the field work, before the trade work, before whatever the particular obligations of this particular household demand. The morning was not preamble. The morning was the first act of a very long play. The pottage is ready, Joan calls the household to eat. There is something I want you to notice about this meal, the quality of attention that surrounds it. No one is looking at anything else. There is nothing else to look at. There are no competing stimuli, no notifications, no ambient news, no soundtrack chosen for atmosphere. There is the pot, the fire, the family, the food. The children eat quickly because they have been hungry since they woke, and the pottage is warm, and this is the warmth that starts the day. Joan eats standing near the fire, watching the household with the particular comprehensive gaze of the person who manages it. William eats in silence, not an unfriendly silence, the silence of someone marshalling themselves for what is coming. The day is fully light now, outside the village is moving. You can hear it. Voices, the sound of feet in the lane, the particular squeal of a gate somewhere down the row. The medieval village was not a quiet place during the working hours. It was a place of constant ambient noise. The blacksmith's hammer when the smithy was operating, the mill when it was running, livestock, children, the carters bringing goods along the track, dogs who were everywhere in the medieval village, sleeping in doorways, slinking between buildings, occasionally someone's pet but more often simply present, useful for hunting and ratting and the vague deterrence of strangers. Joan is washing the bowls with water from the bucket the 12-year-old brought. Not washing in the modern sense. She has no soap, or rather she has a kind of soap made from wood ash and rendered fat, grey and coarse and alkaline, kept in a covered crock for serious cleaning, but not deployed on a Tuesday morning for the daily breakfast bowls. She rinses them, she stacks them, she's already thinking about the next thing. This is what I find most striking about the medieval woman's morning, the cascading nature of it. Before the first task is finished, the next one is already being composed in the mind. There is no moment of completion, of rest, of gathering oneself before the next demand arrives. The demands run together like water. Joan is washing bowls and thinking about the garden. She's feeding the 4-year-old the last of the pottage and thinking about the linen that needs to be taken down from the line before the rain that's probably coming this afternoon. She's standing by the fire and calculating, without quite naming the calculation, how much of the woodpile is left and whether it will get them to the end of the week. The mental arithmetic of running a medieval household was constant, silent, and completely invisible. No one wrote about it. No chronicle noted it. No court record preserved it. It simply happened, inside the minds of women who had been watching their mothers do it since they could walk, and who would watch their daughters do it in turn, and who understood, without anyone ever saying so in those terms, that this invisible calculation was the thing that stood between the household and disaster. William is pulling on his surcoat, the outer layer, the rough wool tunic that goes over everything, and reaching for the long-handled hoe that leans against the wall near the door. He will be in the field today, or on the common, or perhaps at some obligation to the manor, and Joan will be here and there and everywhere at once, managing the interior world of the household while he manages the exterior world of the land. The door opens, cold air, the village lane in the early morning, mud already beginning to show the tracks of feet and wheels and hooves from the day's first activity. William goes out. The day has truly begun. Come with me, because what comes next, the actual work of this village, the craft and the obligation and the hidden knowledge that kept these people alive, is the story that is waiting for you. And the first thing I want to show you, the thing that was happening in every direction from where Joan stands in her doorway watching William walk toward the field, is the medieval village at full working life, and it will genuinely surprise you. Because the medieval village was not a simple place, and the people in it were not simple people. Let us go find out exactly what they knew. Step outside with me for a moment. Stand in the lane of this medieval village on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. Let us say October, because October was one of the most consequential months in the agricultural year, and everything about the village will be in sharper focus with that context, and look around. What you see is movement. Purposeful, practiced, coordinated movement. People going in different directions with specific destinations. Men with tools across their shoulders heading toward the open fields. Women with baskets, with buckets, with children attached to them and tasks ahead of them. The blacksmith's forge already smoking, which means he has been at work for at least an hour. The mill, if the mill is running today, and this was not guaranteed, mills broke, mill wheels jammed, the miller had his own rhythms and his own claims on the water, making the low grinding percussion that was the background sound of the medieval village on a productive day. What I want you to understand about this scene is something that is genuinely difficult to convey through the modern lens of how we think about work and knowledge and skill. Every single person you can see in this lane, from the 10-year-old carrying a bucket to the 60-year-old mending a fence, is carrying a quantity and a quality of technical knowledge that we would find staggering if we could weigh it. Not knowledge that was written down, not knowledge acquired in any formal setting, knowledge that was absorbed through years of watching and doing, passed through touch and demonstration, and the patient repetition of the same tasks across the seasons, knowledge so embodied and so automatic that its possessor might not even be able to articulate what they knew if you asked them. Let me give you a specific example, because abstract claims about medieval people's knowledge tend to flatten into something vague and unconvincing, and this particular example I find genuinely extraordinary. Take William, walking toward the field with his hoe. He knows his land, and I mean knows it in a sense that has no real equivalent in modern experience. He knows the particular drainage patterns of the strips he farms, which corner stays wet after rain, and for how long, which section of soil runs to clay, and which sits on something sandier and more forgiving. He knows what grew in each strip last year and the year before, because the open field system rotated crops across the fields in a fixed pattern. Winter wheat in one field, spring crops in another, fallow in the third, rotating annually. And managing that rotation correctly was the difference between a field that gradually depleted and one that could sustain production for generations. He knows the smell of soil that is ready to be worked versus soil that needs more time. He knows, by some combination of wind direction and cloud formation and the particular quality of the autumn light, how much time he has before the weather changes. This last piece of knowledge is not mysticism. It is observation, accumulated over years, of what particular atmospheric conditions have historically preceded particular weather events in this specific landscape. It is, in the vocabulary of our era, hyperlocal meteorological data acquired through a lifetime of paying extremely close attention, and William carries it so naturally that he could not separate it from simply knowing what was coming. It is part of him. Now walk the other direction, toward the woman you can see tending the kitchen garden at the edge of the village. Her name, let us say, is Margaret. She is not Joan's age. She is older, perhaps 50, which in the medieval village was a genuinely elderly state of being and came with its own particular authority. She is the woman other women came to when a child was sick or when a birth was coming, or when the pottage tasted wrong and they couldn't identify why. She is not a physician. She is not an herbalist in any formal sense. She is a woman who has been paying attention for 50 years. Margaret knows the kitchen garden the way William knows the field. She knows which plants are ready to harvest and which need more time. She knows which of the herbs drying in her rafters should be used for a sick stomach, and which for a chest that has gone tight and crackling. She knows which berries from the hedgerow are edible, and which will make a child violently ill. She knows the signs that a cow is going to have trouble calving, and what the signs of a healthy pregnancy look like in a woman of different ages. She has delivered at least 40 children in this village, quietly, without any title, without any fee, because that was what you did. I want to pause here and name something honestly, because I think it is one of the most important things about the medieval village that we tend to miss. The knowledge that kept these people alive, the real, practical, technical knowledge that determined whether the harvest was sufficient, whether the animals survived the winter, whether the sick child recovered, whether the bread rose properly. This knowledge was overwhelmingly held by ordinary people, not by physicians who were rare and expensive and largely confined to cities, not by scholars who were monastically isolated, not by lords who had their own concerns, by farmers and their wives, by millers, by blacksmiths, by the woman who had been watching the garden for 50 years. And almost none of it was written down. This is what strikes me most about the intellectual life of the medieval village. It was a civilization that ran on oral transmission. The farmer's son learned from the farmer, the midwife learned from the midwife, the blacksmith's apprentice learned by watching and doing, making mistakes in supervised context and understanding through the mistakes why the right way was right. The knowledge was alive, it was constantly being refined and adapted, and it lived in people rather than in books, which meant that when a generation was lost, to plague, to famine, to the particular demographic catastrophes that the medieval world was capable of producing, what they carried went with them. But let us not get ahead of the day, because right now, in this October morning, the village is not thinking about catastrophe, it is thinking about the field. The autumn ploughing. If you wanted to identify the single most important agricultural operation of the medieval year, the one that all other activities pointed toward and away from, the ploughing would be a strong candidate. This was the preparation of the soil for the winter wheat. The grain that would be planted now would send up its first green shoots before the killing frosts, would sit dormant through the coldest months, would revive in spring, and would be harvested in July. Without the autumn ploughing, without the winter wheat, the gap between the end of last year's harvest and the arrival of the new harvest in summer became a crisis. It was the ploughing that stood between the village and what people of this era called the hungry months. The plough itself was a remarkable piece of technology for its time, and understanding it helps understand why William and the other farming men of the village moved through the morning with the particular focused seriousness they did. The heavy mouldboard plough of medieval England, evolved over centuries from Roman designs, adapted to the specific conditions of English soil, was not a simple digging tool. It was a machine a machine made of wood and iron, requiring skilled carpentry to construct and skilled smithing to fit with its iron shares and coulters, requiring multiple draft animals to pull, usually 4 oxen, sometimes 8, sometimes a combination of oxen and horses, and requiring a skilled ploughman to manage the team and keep the furrow straight and the depth consistent. Straight furrows mattered. A crooked furrow produced drainage problems, uneven soil preparation, irregular seed germination. The ploughman who could maintain a straight line across a half-acre strip was a craftsman in a literal sense, and he was respected accordingly in the social hierarchy of the village. The art of ploughing was one of the skills that separated a competent farmer from a merely adequate one, and it was a skill learned only through years of practice. Walking behind the plough was brutal work physically. The handles of the plough required constant management, adjusting the angle as conditions changed, lifting slightly over obstacles, pressing down to maintain depth. The ploughman walked 10 to 12 miles in a day of ploughing. He breathed the turned soil. His arms absorbed the constant vibration and the sudden jars of stone or root. His hands, already calloused from every other form of manual labour, developed their own particular calluses from the plough handles. And while he walked, he watched. He watched the soil being turned over, the colour of it, the texture, the moisture content, the presence of earthworms which were a sign of good soil health, the absence of them which was a concern. He was reading the field continuously, making adjustments, understanding things about this particular piece of ground that could not be learned from any book, because no book contained this specific field. Over to the left of where William and the plough team are working, on the common land that the village shared, you can see the cattle being driven out to graze. This is the job that falls to the village herdsman, a designated role in most medieval communities, the man responsible for managing the collective grazing on behalf of all the households who held common rights. Managing the common grazing was more complex than it sounds. The common could support a finite number of animals, too many, and the grass was overgrazed, the ground churned to mud, the resource degraded. The medieval village had developed, over generations, elaborate rules about how many animals each household was entitled to graze, what the stinting regulations were, how overstocking was detected and penalised. These rules were not written in any charter most of the time, they were known. They lived in the community's memory, enforced by the pressure of collective observation. The village court, the manorial court that met several times a year, handled violations, but the detection of violations depended on the whole village watching the whole village. Everyone knew everyone's cattle. Everyone knew approximately how many beasts you were entitled to run. When someone pushed beyond their entitlement, someone else noticed, and the matter came to the court. This is another dimension of the medieval village that I find quietly remarkable. It was a remarkably legalistic society in some respects, not because anyone studied law, but because the management of shared resources, land, water, woodland, common grazing, required agreed rules and enforcement mechanisms, and the village had developed them organically over centuries of collective necessity. Let me take you somewhere else in the village now, because the field and the common are only part of what is happening this morning. Walk down the lane toward the blacksmith's forge. You can hear it before you see it. The regular percussion of hammer on iron, the hiss and spit when heated metal meets water. Step close, but not too close. The heat of an open forge is substantial. The blacksmith, whose name let us say is Thomas, is working on a ploughshare. The iron share, the cutting edge of the plough, the part that actually contacts the soil, wears and deforms with use. It needs regular reshaping and occasionally replacing. Thomas will spend part of this morning reshaping the share that has been brought to him, and the quality of his work, the hardness of the iron he achieves, the geometry of the cutting edge he produces, will directly affect how efficiently the plough cuts through the autumn soil. Thomas knows his iron, he knows it by colour. The progression of colours that heated iron passes through, from the dull red of warming metal, through orange, through the brilliant yellow-white of maximum heat, tells him the temperature of the metal, and therefore what operations are possible. Too cool, and the iron resists the hammer. Too hot, and it burns rather than deforms. The narrow window of workability, a matter of seconds, is read visually, and the hammer falls at exactly the right moment. This is not mystical knowledge. It is material science, practiced empirically, accumulated through years of repetition and observation, and the corrective feedback of failures. Thomas could not explain it in the vocabulary of modern metallurgy, but he knows it more intimately in some sense than any metallurgist reading it from a textbook ever could. Now let me bring you back to Joan. Because while William is at the field and Thomas is at the forge and the herdsman is managing the cattle, Joan is doing something that I think deserves its own extended consideration, because it represents a form of complexity and intelligence that the historical record has consistently undervalued and that I find genuinely astonishing to look at directly. She is making bread. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Let me walk you through what making bread actually required in a medieval village household. First, the grain. If Joan is making bread today, she will have needed to take grain to the mill, the Lord's mill, the one the village was obligated to use and obligated to pay for using, and had it ground into flour. The mill was not always available because millers were in demand, and the water-powered mill depended on the flow of the mill race, which depended on the rainfall, which was always uncertain. Joan kept track of when the mill was likely to be free and planned accordingly. She had a mental schedule of her household's flour requirements that projected forward weeks, based on how many mouths she was feeding and how often she could get to the mill and what the current state of the grain stores was. The flour she got from the mill was not the refined white flour we use today. It was wholemeal flour, coarser than even the whole wheat flour you can buy in a modern shop, and it contained varying amounts of bran, the outer husk of the grain. The loaves made from it were dense and dark, not unpleasant, not at all, but bearing very little resemblance to what we now call bread. Into a wooden trough, Joan measures flour by eye and by feel, by the handful, by the weight of it in her hands, by the decades of bread-making that have calibrated her intuition exactly. She makes a well in the centre of the flour. She adds water, cool water, not cold, because cold water slows the yeast. She adds a portion of the previous batch's dough that she has been keeping, a lump of it preserved in a covered pot near the cool side of the hearth. This is her leavening, this is her yeast, not dried yeast in a packet, not anything purchased or manufactured, a living culture of wild yeast that she has been maintaining, feeding with flour and water, keeping alive across weeks and months, because if it died she would need to start the long process of establishing a new one, begging a piece of dough from a neighbour, starting again from scratch. The maintenance of the sourdough culture was a genuine technical responsibility. It could go wrong. Too warm and it over-fermented, too cold and it languished, too dry and it died. Joan knew by the smell of it and the texture of it, and the speed of its bubble whether it was healthy, and she made adjustments accordingly. She did not have words for this in the vocabulary of microbiology, but she understood it, practically completely, in the way you understand something that you tend every day. She works the dough. This is physical labour. Bread dough requires substantial kneading to develop the gluten network that gives it structure. Without it, the bread will be flat and dense in the wrong way. Joan kneads with the heels of her hands, folding and pressing for 10 or 15 minutes, and the dough becomes smooth and elastic under her hands. She has been doing this so long that the motion is meditative. The 4-year-old is playing in the rushes near the fire. The world outside is going on without her for these minutes. The dough goes back in the trough, covered with a cloth, set near enough to the fire that the warmth will encourage rising. Joan wipes her hands on her apron. She's already thinking about the next thing. Because there is always a next thing. Let me tell you some of the other things happening in the village this morning, because I want you to feel the full texture of what this community was producing collectively on an ordinary working day. Over in one of the larger crofts, the enclosed piece of land attached to a more prosperous holding, a woman named Alice is shearing the last of the sheep that still need shearing before the onset of winter. This is late shearing, the cutting of wool that had grown back partially after the spring clip, and Alice moves through it with the mechanical efficiency of long practice, her left hand controlling the animal, and her right hand managing the hand shears, the blades running close to the skin without cutting it. She's thinking about whether this wool is worth spinning herself or whether it should go to market. She's calculating prices, quality, her household's need for cash income versus their need for home-produced cloth, a calculation that has no obvious answer and that she will resolve through a combination of judgment and practical necessity. In the mill, the miller's wife, let us call her Maud, is managing the flow of grain through the millstones and the collection of flour in the sacks below. She's also managing the flow of customers, the queue of villagers who have brought their grain and need it processed. The delicate social arithmetic of whose turn it is, who has been waiting longest, who has a particular urgency, a sick household, a depleted store, a child to feed, and no other options. Maud is in the middle of a constant low-level negotiation, and she is doing it while also keeping track of the mill itself, because a mill that runs too fast or with the stone set too close damages the grain, and a mill that runs too slow produces flour too slowly for the day's queue. At the edge of the village, near the pond, 2 men are cutting reeds from the marshy ground. Reed was the thatching material for the roofs of most village houses, not straw in the earliest medieval period, though straw thatching became more common later, but water reed, cut in autumn and dried and bundled and stored for use in the following year's thatching season. A thatched roof in good condition could last 15 to 20 years. A thatched roof that was left unattended past its useful life became a liability, admitting water, rotting its substrate, eventually failing. The 2 men cutting reeds this morning are not doing it because they need their roofs fixed immediately. They are doing it because the community's roofs will always need fixing, and the supply of materials had to be maintained in advance of the need. This long-time horizon, the constant investment in future needs, the preparation months and years in advance of the requirement, is one of the features of medieval village life that I find most striking when I look at it directly. These were people who thought ahead necessarily because the consequences of not thinking ahead were immediate and serious. The reed cut in October kept the roof sound in February. The grain stored carefully in August stood between the household and hunger in March. The fire banked last night was the fire that started this morning. The knowledge passed to the child watching became the competence of the adult managing. Nothing was accidental, nothing was casual. The present was always being worked for the future. The bread dough has been rising for an hour. Joan checks it. She presses a finger into the surface and watches how the indentation behaves, whether it springs back quickly or slowly, how the interior looks when she tears off a small piece at the edge. These observations tell her things that no timer could tell her. The dough is ready. Now comes the baking, and this is where the particular challenge of the medieval village kitchen makes itself felt most sharply. Joan does not have an oven of her own. Most village households did not. Building and maintaining a true bread oven, the domed clay structure set separately from the house, heated with a fire inside it, and then raked clean for baking, was beyond the means and the space of most ordinary village crofts. Some villages had a communal oven, provided by the lord, used by the villagers on a rotating or fee-paying basis. In some households, bread was baked directly on the hearthstone under an iron pot inverted over the dough, creating a makeshift oven. Joan is going to bake her bread at Margaret's house. Margaret, being one of the older and more established women of the village, has a proper clay oven in her garden, and there is a long-standing arrangement by which Joan and 2 or 3 other village women contribute to the fuel for heating Margaret's oven in exchange for baking rights. It is a small local economy of favours and obligations, maintained by everyone's understanding that resources pooled are more productive than resources kept separate. Joan shapes her dough into loaves, covers them with a cloth, and the 4-year-old runs alongside her as she carries them down the lane to Margaret's. The oven there is already heated. Margaret has been up since before Joan this morning, which is saying something. The fire has been burning inside the clay dome for 2 hours, bringing the interior to the temperature required for baking. Here is how Joan knows the oven is ready. She holds her arm in the opening and counts. Not seconds. There were no reliable seconds in the medieval village, no mechanically uniform unit of time smaller than the hour on the church clock. She counts her heartbeats, or she uses some other internal rhythm that serves the same purpose, a technique so personal and so informal that the women who used it would not have been able to explain it to an outsider, but that produced, in practiced hands, remarkably consistent results. The arm is drawn back, the oven is ready. Joan's loaves go in, another woman's loaves go in after because there is a queue, and the order of the queue reflects the social hierarchy of the village in ways that everyone understands without saying. Margaret's own baking comes first because it is her oven, then Joan, whose arrangement is oldest, then the others. The door of the oven is sealed with a clay bung. The loaves will bake for the better part of an hour. Joan walks back up the lane toward her house. There are 6 other things that need doing before the bread is ready to come out, and she is already deciding which order to do them in. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it captures something essential about the quality of daily life in the medieval village that no single dramatic event could capture. The overlapping structure of every task, the way that no single thing can be completed without reference to the other things happening simultaneously. Bread baking does not pause the rest of life. The animals still need water, the garden still needs attention. The child trailing behind her still needs feeding and minding. The linen that has been soaking needs to be dealt with before it sours. The planning for dinner, and dinner, the main meal of the day, served around noon, is not going to cook itself, has to be running in the background of everything else. This is not stress in the modern sense, or rather it is a different kind of stress, lower in acute anxiety perhaps, because the problems are concrete and physical, and the solutions, where solutions exist, are also concrete and physical. But the density of it is real. The demand on a medieval woman's attention and energy and judgment was constant, continuous, and, this is the part that strikes me most, entirely unremarked on by anyone, including the woman herself. Because this was simply Tuesday. The bell from the church tower, if this village has a bell, and by the 13th century most English villages did, rings at some point in the mid-morning, the terce bell, marking one of the canonical hours of the ecclesiastical day. It is not a summons to church. It is a time marker, a reminder that the morning is progressing, that there is a particular passage in the day where it now is. People look up when the bell rings, not dramatically. A brief lift of the head, a quick internal reckoning of what has been done and what remains, and then back to work. Come with me now, because I want to show you something that happens in this village around midday, something that I think is the heart of this medieval day, the moment when the whole community's effort becomes briefly visible all at once. And from there, I want to take you inside the household at the noon meal, because what the people of this village actually ate, and how they ate it, and what the table looked like and who sat where, is the next chapter of this story. And I promise you, it will be nothing like what you're expecting. Come back inside. Joan has retrieved the bread from the oven, a small, warm, fragrant victory in what has been a complex morning. The loaves sit on the board, wrapped in a cloth, cooling. They are dense, dark, cracked across the top, and they smell of the particular rich earthiness that is wholemeal bread baked in a clay oven heated with wood. It is one of the best smells in the world, honestly, and it is the same in the 14th century as it is in the 21st. Some things do not change. It is approaching noon now. The light has shifted. The pale October sun is as high as it is going to get, which in England in October is not very high, and the light has that particular thin quality of autumn, clear but not warm, casting long shadows even at midday. Inside the house the fire is burning steadily. The pot is back over the heat, because dinner does not happen automatically. Let me tell you what dinner in a medieval village household actually looked like, and I want to start by clearing away the image you probably have, because it is almost certainly wrong. The popular image of medieval food, at least the version that has filtered through into movies and television, and the general cultural imagination, draws from two sources. The first is the feast, the great hall, the roasted boar, the towers of bread, the rivers of wine, the lords and ladies in elaborate dress eating enormous quantities of dramatically prepared food. The second is a kind of vague pastoral romanticism, simple wholesome fare, bread and cheese and ale, honest and uncomplicated. The first image describes the food of perhaps 2 or 3% of the medieval population. The second is partially right but missing most of the detail, and the detail is where the reality lives. The central truth about medieval peasant food is that it was grain-based in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. Grain, wheat, rye, barley, oats, depending on region and quality of land, was the foundation of the diet. Not as an accompaniment, not as one component among many, but as the overwhelming core of daily caloric intake. Historians studying the dietary records of medieval English peasant households have estimated that between 50 and 80% of a working person's calories came from grain in various forms. The rest came from vegetables, legumes, small quantities of dairy, and occasional meat. That word occasional needs sitting with. Because when we hear that medieval peasants ate meat, we tend to imagine that this means frequently, regularly, in the way we eat it today. It did not mean this. For most ordinary households in most ordinary years, fresh meat appeared at the table perhaps a handful of times per week during good seasons, and less during lean ones. The regular proteins of the medieval diet were legumes, peas and beans and lentils dried and stored and cooked endlessly in pottage, and dairy, primarily in the form of curds and whey and occasional cheese. The pig that Joan and William keep, the pig in the small enclosure behind the house, the pig that the 12-year-old checked on this morning as his first task of the day, will be slaughtered in November at Martinmas, the Feast of St. Martin, which was the traditional pig-killing time across medieval Europe. The logic was simple. By November, the green fodder that the pig could forage was largely gone. You could not feed a pig through the winter on stored grain. The grain was for people, so you killed the pig before it became a liability, and you preserved everything preservable. The salted pork from that November slaughter was the meat that appeared in Joan's pot all winter. Not in generous quantities. A piece of salt pork the size of a fist in a pot of pottage serves a family of 6 as flavouring, as a source of fat, as something that made the peas and grain more satisfying, but not as the central substance of the meal. The central substance of the meal was always the grain. Let me describe what dinner looks like today. Joan has made a thick pottage of dried peas and oats, with a small piece of salt pork that has been simmering in it since mid-morning, with a handful of dried herbs from the rafters, some thyme, possibly some dried parsley, that soften the earthiness of the legumes and add a green note to the smell. The pottage is very thick now, close to a stew in consistency, the peas broken down into the liquid, the oats dissolved, the salt pork shrunk and softened. It is hot. It is filling. It is, in the context of what is available and what is needed, genuinely good. There is bread, the bread from this morning, and there may be, if the hens have been productive, an egg or two. Eggs were valuable enough that selling them at market was a regular source of small income for village households. A surplus egg eaten at home was a domestic luxury, not an everyday right. There is probably ale, not the ale you might imagine with its connotations of revelry and excess. Small ale, the mild, low-alcohol brew made from malted barley or oats, slightly fermented, and consumed in the way that modern people consume water, because like colonial Americans 3 centuries later, medieval villagers understood that water from the village pond or the stream running past the mill was not reliably safe to drink. Small ale was genuinely safe. It was the functional hydration of the medieval working person. Joan pours the ale from a ceramic jug into wooden cups. She ladles the pottage into bowls, pottery bowls, some chipped, one with a repaired crack that has been filled with something, a repair made carefully because bowls were not nothing, bowls were not disposable. The household comes in to eat. William from the field, hand still carrying the soil of the morning, the 12-year-old from whatever task he was set, the 9-year-old who has been with Joan all morning, small enough to still be companion rather than worker, but old enough to carry the bucket without spilling too much. The 4-year-old is already at the table, or rather already at the bench, because the distinction between table and bench in a modest medieval household was not always very clear. The table was sometimes a board laid across 2 trestles, assembled for meals and disassembled after, and the seating was benches, long ones along the sides. Here is something that I find remarkable about the medieval meal, and it connects to everything we know about how these communities functioned. The meal happened at a specific time, called the household together from wherever they were, and for the duration of the meal, perhaps half an hour, perhaps a little longer, everyone was in the same place doing the same thing. This sounds mundane until you realise that it was the only time in the entire day when this was reliably true. Work scattered the household across the village, the field, the croft, the forge, the mill, the market on market day. People were distributed through the landscape from first light, each following the particular demands of their work. The meal was the centripetal force that drew them back together. Twice daily, the main dinner at noon, the lighter supper in the evening, the household reconstituted itself around the fire and the pot. It was not optional, and it was not casual. It was the structural heartbeat of domestic life. Now I want to tell you something about medieval food that the popular image gets almost completely wrong, and that I find, honestly, one of the most interesting historical corrections I've encountered in all my reading on this period. Medieval food, for people who could manage a varied diet, was genuinely and deliberately seasoned. Not blandly, not in the way that simple peasant food is sometimes described, as though simplicity necessarily meant tastelessness. Herbs were grown in kitchen gardens and dried carefully, precisely because they transformed the pottage from something merely sustaining to something worth eating. The herb garden was not a luxury. It was a functional appendage of the kitchen, Maintained with genuine care, its contents rotated through the seasons and dried and stored with the same attention that grain was stored. Medieval people also had access to spices, and this is where the historical record genuinely surprises people. The spice trade, the movement of pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and other Eastern spices through Arab and then Venetian trading networks into Northern Europe, was not confined to the wealthy, not entirely. Pepper, the most common and most important spice of the medieval world, was expensive, but not prohibitively so for anyone above the poverty line. The court rolls of medieval English manors record pepper being purchased by households that were solidly agricultural, not gentry. Ginger and cinnamon appear in cookbooks aimed at the middling sort of householder, not just at aristocratic kitchens. The picture that emerges from careful study of medieval English food culture is not of a population grimly choking down grey pottage. It is of people who worked extremely hard to make their food good, who took genuine pleasure in what they ate when what they ate was worth taking pleasure in, who invested real labour in flavouring and variety, and who understood, empirically and intuitively, that food that tasted good was food that people ate fully and with enjoyment, and that a fed and satisfied household worked better than a depleted and resentful one. The seasonal rhythm of the medieval diet is another thing that deserves attention, because it shaped the experience of eating in ways that are completely alien to modern life. We eat strawberries in December now because they have been grown in a greenhouse in Spain and flown to a distribution centre and trucked to the supermarket near your house. In the medieval village, strawberries appeared for approximately 3 weeks in June, and then they were gone until the following June. The arrival of each new seasonal food, the first peas of early summer, the blackberries at the end of August, the apples in September, the wild mushrooms after the autumn rains, was a genuine event. Not performed, not artificial, genuinely exciting in the way that things are exciting when they are brief and cannot be had any other time. The autumn harvest, the period we are in now in our October village, was a season of relative abundance that the whole community felt. The grain was in, the apples had been gathered, the pigs were fat from foraging through summer and autumn. The cellars and storerooms were as full as they were going to be until next harvest. There was a specific emotional quality to this season, a relief mixed with the knowledge that the abundance was now finite, that what was in the storeroom was what there was, and the careful management of it through the winter was what determined how hungry March became. This awareness, the awareness that what you were eating now existed in a fixed quantity, that there was no restocking the shelves midwinter, that the household's decisions about consumption now had direct consequences for survival later, gave the autumn table a particular weight. The pottage was good today. Enjoy it fully and measure it. There is something I want to be honest about here, as someone who finds this history genuinely moving to think about. The medieval diet for most ordinary people in most ordinary years was adequate, not generous, not varied in the way we would mean the word today, but adequate. It provided enough calories for heavy physical labour, enough protein and fat to sustain health under normal conditions. The great catastrophes of medieval nutrition, the famines, the hunger crises, the desperate springs when the stored grain ran out before the new harvest was ready, these were real and they were terrible, but they were not the normal year. The normal year was managed. The normal year got through. What the normal year looked like at the table was exactly this: the thick pottage, the dense bread, the small ale, the household gathered around the fire for half an hour in the middle of a working day. Not magnificent, not the stuff of paintings, but sustaining and warm and shared. Joan has not sat down yet. She is ladling. She is checking that the 4-year-old has enough without having too much of the salt pork, which is strictly rationed. She is watching the bread to make sure no one tears too large a piece. Not because she is unkind, but because the bread has to last through supper and breakfast tomorrow, and if they eat too freely now, there will not be enough later. She is simultaneously present at the table and managing the future from it, seeing not just the meal that is happening, but the meals that have to come after. She eats last standing. She always eats last standing. I want to leave this meal with you for a moment before we move on, because I think it is one of those images that does something to your understanding of what ordinary life costs, and what it produces, and where the nourishment comes from, the kind that is more than calories. The family is together. The work of the morning has been done, The bread is warm, the fire is burning. And Joan is still standing, watching over all of it, the last one served and the first one to go back to work when the bowl is empty. What comes next? What the table of this household reveals about its social structure, who has authority here and where it comes from and how it is displayed, the invisible grammar of the medieval dinner, is the story waiting for us. And it is more interesting, I promise you, than the food. You might think that after everything we have just seen, the bread baked carefully all morning, the pottage tended and seasoned, the bread rationed with quiet precision, the meal itself would be the main event, the thing that everything was building toward. In the medieval village, the meal was not quite the point, or rather, the meal was the occasion, and the occasion was the social order made visible. Every time this household gathered around the table, something was being said without words about who belonged where in the world, and the saying of it was as important, in a sense, as the eating of it. Let us start with William. William sits at the head of the table. This is not a preference. It is not because he has had a longer morning or deserves a better view of the room. He sits there because in the medieval household, as in the colonial household 3.5 centuries later, the head of the family occupied the head of the table as a matter of law, theology, and custom so deeply interwoven that distinguishing them was impossible. He was the legal representative of the household. He was, in the eyes of the church and the manorial court alike, responsible for the conduct and the obligations of everyone under his roof. He owed the labour obligations to the Lord. He paid the dues. He was answerable for the family. Joan sits where she always sits, not at the opposite end, not quite that formal in a household of this modest means, but to William's right, which was the position of the wife in most English households of the period, close enough to manage the serving, positioned to move easily between the table and the fire, present but not equal in the architecture of the seating. Her position at the table reflected exactly her position in the household, essential, competent, indispensable, and structurally subordinate. The children sit in order of age below their parents, in the literal spatial sense of further down the table. The 4-year-old, being too young to be trusted on the bench without supervision, may sit on Joan's lap or on a low stool at her feet. The 9-year-old sits where she is put. The 12-year-old, approaching the threshold of a kind of adolescent independence, sits at the edge of the adult arrangements without quite being part of them. If there is a servant in this household, the servant sits last, below the children, at the foot of the table, served last and given whatever remains. This arrangement, the graduated seating, the hierarchy made physical and spatial at every meal, was not considered cruel or unusual. It was considered correct. It was the household's internal social order displayed and reinforced twice daily. The table was not just where you ate. It was where you were placed in the world, reminded of your placing, and participated in maintaining the placing of others. I want to tell you about grace, because it is the frame that held the meal, and understanding it changes how the whole thing looks. Grace, the blessing said before eating, was not optional in the medieval Christian household. This was not because anyone was watching, not in any immediate policing sense, but because the relationship between the household and the divine was understood as constant and immediate, and the meal was a specifically sacred moment within that relationship. Food was not merely fuel. Food was God's provision, and acknowledging that provision before eating was as natural and necessary as eating itself. The medieval table grace was said by the head of the household, as his role as the domestic priest of the family required. In the wealthiest households, the grace might be elaborate, drawn from liturgical formulas and extended into something approaching a small service. In a village household like this one, it would be simpler, a brief Latin formula that William had learned as a child and repeated without necessarily understanding the Latin, in the way that children absorb the forms of religious practice long before they encounter the theological content. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the crossing of oneself, a brief acknowledgement, and then the meal began. The crossing of oneself at meals was habitual, automatic, as unconscious as we might consider washing your hands before eating. But it was not meaningless. It was a constant small reinsertion of the sacred into the ordinary, a reminder, practiced 12 times a day at different moments, that the ordinary was not finally separate from the sacred. The Church had designed the liturgical calendar, the hours of prayer, the feast days, the fasts, precisely to maintain this interpenetration, to prevent the sacred from receding into Sunday morning and the ordinary from swallowing the rest. Now let me tell you about the fasts, because they shaped the medieval diet so profoundly that you cannot understand what people ate without understanding when they were not supposed to eat certain things. The medieval church prescribed fasting, abstinence from meat and animal products specifically, on Fridays, the day of the crucifixion, on Saturdays in some traditions, on the vigils of major feast days, and throughout the 40 days of Lent before Easter. In a full year, this added up to roughly a third of all days, 150 days or more on which the household was not supposed to eat meat. This is not simply a religious rule, it is an ecological and economic fact that shaped the entire food system of medieval England. Fish, the primary substitute for meat on fast days, became a major industry. The herring trade, the cod fisheries off the Icelandic and North Sea coasts, the management of local fish ponds by monasteries and manors, the dried and salted stockfish that could be kept for months and transported inland. All of this infrastructure existed partly to serve the fasting requirements of the Christian calendar. In the village household, fast days meant that the pottage contained no meat and no lard, that the bread was made without the dripping that might otherwise be added to improve its texture, that the eggs from the hens and the hard cheese from the dairy were the primary proteins. Lenten cooking, the cooking of the 40 days before Easter, when the winter stores were running low and the new spring had not yet produced anything, was its own challenging discipline, and the medieval housewife who managed Lent well, keeping the household fed and adequately nourished on the reduced palette of permitted ingredients, was exercising a form of culinary ingenuity that deserves recognition. The manorial court records show that violations of fasting regulations were taken seriously at the community level. This was not because the church had an enforcement arm in every household. It was because the community itself enforced the norms. If you smelled meat cooking from your neighbour's house on a Friday, that was a matter for the village. The social pressure to comply was as important as any theological commitment. The medieval community watched itself, as we have seen in the management of the common, and the table was part of what it watched. Let me return now to what is actually happening at Joan and William's table, because I want you to see it clearly before we move on. The meal is eaten largely in silence, not an oppressive silence, not a punitive one, but the silence of people who are tired and hungry and focused on the thing in front of them. The pottage is good today, the bread is warm, the small ale is cool, the 4-year-old makes some noise, as 4-year-olds do, and is managed with the automatic calm of a mother who has been managing 4-year-olds all morning. The 12-year-old eats with the focused efficiency of a boy who has been doing hard work and is genuinely hungry. The 9-year-old watches everything, as 9-year-olds do. William speaks occasionally. He might mention what he observed in the field this morning, or he might comment on something he heard from another man while working, a piece of village news, an observation about the weather for this afternoon, a remark about the progress of the ploughing. Joan responds briefly. The household is not a place of elaborate conversation at the dinner table, not in the middle of a working day. There is too much to do before the light goes. I want to notice something about the texture of authority at this table, because it is subtler than the formal hierarchy of seating makes it appear. William is the head of the household. He sits at the head. He says grace. His word is, in the formal sense, final. And yet, and this is something that the historical record is careful about distinguishing, the day-to-day management of this household is Joan's domain, and everyone at the table knows it. The food that appears on this table came from Joan's planning and labour. The bread was made by Joan. The pottage was made by Joan. The herbs in the pottage were grown in Joan's garden and dried by Joan's hands and stored in Joan's rafter bundles. The decision about how much pork to put in the pot today and how much to save for later was Joan's calculation, made with Joan's knowledge of the stores. William's formal authority was real and legally powerful. Joan's practical authority was equally real and constantly exercised. These two things existed in the medieval household simultaneously, and the complexity of that coexistence is one of the things that makes the history of domestic life genuinely interesting rather than simply a record of women's oppression, which it certainly also was. The meal is ending. The bowls are scraped clean. Again, this was not a virtue, this was economics, and the scraping was done with a piece of bread which was then eaten because nothing was wasted. And the table, if it was assembled on trestles, might be taken apart and moved aside to clear the room for the afternoon's work. Or it might be left in place, a permanent feature of the room. William is going back to the field, the 12-year-old with him. The 9-year-old is going to the garden. Joan is going to the bread that needs to be checked one more time, and to the stored grain that she has been meaning to look at, and to a dozen other things that have been waiting for the morning to finish. The 4-year-old is asleep on the bench, face slightly sticky with pottage, entirely unconscious of the social order that has just been carefully performed around them. The afternoon is beginning. And what the afternoon holds, the particular labour of the village in these October hours, the texture of the time between noon and sunset, is what I want to show you next. But more than the labour, I want to show you someone specific. One woman in this village whose documented experience gives us a window into this world that is clearer and more honest than any general description can be. She is waiting just ahead of us. Come with me into the afternoon. The afternoon light in October has a specific quality that I find almost impossible to describe without resorting to the visual language I normally try to avoid. But let me try, because it matters. It is horizontal, that is the word. The sun, low in the sky, sends its light across the world sideways rather than down, illuminating the vertical face of everything, the east side of the trees, the east walls of the houses, the standing stalks of harvested grain in the field, while leaving the western and northern faces in a shadow that already carries the feeling of the evening in it. By 3 o'clock in October in England, the light has this quality, this sense that the day has crested and is now running downhill toward dark. Joan knows this light. She does not need to look at the sky to know it. She feels it in the way the warmth has shifted, in the sound of the afternoon, which is different from the sound of the morning, quieter, more settled, the village's activity having found its midday rhythm and now running on it. She knows what this light means. There are perhaps 3.5 hours of useful daylight left, and there is still a great deal to do. Let me walk you through the afternoon of a medieval village woman, because I think it is the part of the day that is most systematically underestimated in how we think about this world, and the part that most rewards careful attention. The afternoon, for a woman like Joan in a household like this one, was the time when the work that the morning had not had room for came to the front. The morning was structured by the demands of food, bread, fire, pottage, the serving of the household, and by whatever immediate agricultural or domestic tasks could not be deferred. The afternoon was when the longer, slower, more invisible work happened. Textile work. Let me start there, because it was the single largest category of domestic labour in the medieval household after food production, and it was virtually ceaseless. The clothing worn by the people of this household did not arrive in boxes from distribution centres. It was not purchased from a shop. In a village household of modest means in medieval England, most cloth was produced within the household or within the immediate community by a chain of processes that began with the raw fibre, wool from their own sheep or flax grown in the garden, and ended many weeks and much labour later in woven cloth. And from that cloth, the clothing was cut and sewn by hand, one stitch at a time. In the afternoon, Joan spins. The drop spindle, the simpler tool predating the spinning wheel, still widely used in the medieval period, is a wooden spindle weighted at the bottom with a whirl of stone or clay. You attach your cleaned and combed fibre to the top, twist the spindle to set it spinning, and let it drop and spin freely, the spinning motion drawing and twisting the fibre into thread as it falls. The process is deceptively simple-looking and genuinely skilled. The thread produced by an unskilled spinner is uneven, thick in some places, thin in others, prone to breaking. The thread produced by a skilled spinner, after years of practice, has a consistent twist and a consistent thickness that will produce even, strong cloth. Joan is a skilled spinner. She's been doing this since she was 8 years old, learning from her mother who learned from her mother. Her hands do it now with the automatic competence of long practice, and she can spin and also think about something else. The stores, the state of the 9-year-old's dress, the thing William said at dinner about the fence line on the North Strip. And the thread continues to come out even and strong. The spinning wheel, by the way, the great wheel or walking wheel, was in wide use in England by the late medieval period, and Joan may have access to one, though it was more likely to be found in a somewhat more prosperous household or in a workshop. The wheel was faster than the drop spindle but required a different technique. You walked backward from the wheel as you drafted the fibre, maintaining tension, then walked forward to wind the thread. It was called the walking wheel for exactly this reason. The repetitive motion, backward and forward for hours was not comfortable, but it was efficient. What strikes me about the textile labour of the medieval household is its sheer scale when you begin to calculate it. A family of 6 needs clothing, outer garments, underlinen, stockings, shoes. These wear, they tear, they are outgrown by children who are constantly growing. They are damaged by the hard physical work of agricultural labour. The production and maintenance of the household's textile supply was effectively never finished. There was always more thread to spin, more cloth to weave if the household had a loom, more mending to do, more worn pieces to replace. The mending pile was a permanent feature of the medieval household, and it shrank only when someone was sick with exhaustion or the light had genuinely run out. The mending happened in the afternoon too. Joan's needle, bone or bronze or occasionally iron, these were not cheap. Needles were genuine household valuables that were kept carefully and retrieved frantically when lost. Work steadily through a tear in the 12-year-old's tunic that happened this morning, as she knew it would, because the 12-year-old moves through the world with the comprehensive physical recklessness of his age. While Joan works, the household moves around her. The 4-year-old has woken from the bench nap and is playing near the hearth with a collection of objects that constitute their entire toy collection: a carved wooden animal, battered and smooth from long handling, a small ball of rags, a length of cord. The 9-year-old comes in from the garden, hands dirty, to report on the state of the leeks and the kale that still need harvesting before the first real frost. Joan listens, asks a question, makes a decision, sends the child back out with instructions. This constant dual focus, the task at hand in the hands, the household in the peripheral vision and the active mind, is something I want to name explicitly, because I think it is one of the least appreciated forms of cognitive labour in the medieval domestic world. Joan is not simply doing one thing at a time, she's doing one thing while monitoring several others, while holding in working memory a complex set of plans and contingencies and upcoming obligations, while making dozens of small decisions that no one will ever notice unless she makes them wrong. The management of a medieval household required something that we might, in the modern vocabulary, call executive function, the ability to hold multiple competing priorities simultaneously, to plan across different time horizons, to allocate limited resources among competing demands, to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information. Joan does this all day, every day, without anyone naming it, without anyone calling it impressive, without any word for it at all. It is simply what the household required. It is simply what she provided. Now let me tell you about the garden in the afternoon, because the kitchen garden of the medieval village household was another of those invisible engines of domestic life that tends to be overlooked. The 9-year-old is in the garden right now harvesting the last of the leeks. The garden, the close, the croft, the toft, it had different names in different regions, was the piece of land immediately attached to the house, enclosed, cultivated intensively, producing a year-round supply of vegetables, herbs, and sometimes fruit that was genuinely essential to the household's food security. The open fields produced grain. The garden produced everything else that went into the pot. In Joan's garden, leeks certainly, because leeks were one of the most important vegetables of the medieval English diet, hardy enough to stand through much of the winter, flavourful enough to make pottage interesting, and productive enough to reward the labour of growing them. Onions for similar reasons, garlic, which was used more liberally in medieval cooking than we sometimes imagine, cabbages and kale, both of which could be harvested in cold weather, peas and beans, which had been harvested and dried earlier and now hung in bundles in the rafters, waiting for the pot, parsley, thyme, sage, mint, possibly some more exotic herbs, hyssop, borage, lovage, that had found their way into the garden from the monastic herbal tradition that had filtered down to village level through generations of use. The herb section of the garden was not decorative. It was medicinal and culinary simultaneously, and the woman who maintained it understood the functions of what she grew. Thyme was good in pottage and good for a cough. Sage was excellent for flavouring and helpful for a sore throat gargled in hot water. Mint was a digestive aid and a flavouring for drinks. These were not formal medical prescriptions. They were accumulated practical wisdom, embedded in the practice of growing and using, passed from woman to woman across generations. The garden was also the source of materials for dyeing, for cleaning, for dozens of small practical applications that the historical record rarely captures in full because they were too ordinary to bother writing down. The woman who maintained a kitchen garden was a herbalist, a cook, a pharmacist, and a food security specialist simultaneously. She would not have used any of those words. The afternoon is moving. The light, that horizontal October light, is shifting towards something warmer in colour and shorter in shadow. The fire in the house needs attention. Joan has been adding wood at intervals through the afternoon, maintaining it at the right level for the evening meal that is beginning to require planning. Let me tell you what happens in this household in the late afternoon, as the day begins its turn toward evening, because it is the moment where all the threads of the medieval day begin to come together. William comes in from the field. He's tired in the way that outdoor physical labour produces, a tiredness that lives in specific muscles, shoulders, lower back, legs, and that carries its own kind of satisfaction alongside the ache. He says something to Joan about how the ploughing went. She tells him something about the leeks. This exchange of household information is brief and practical. It is also, in some real sense, the moment when the two halves of the household's work meet and acknowledge each other. The 12-year-old comes in, the 9-year-old comes in, the 4-year-old is already in, has been in all afternoon and requires no returning. Margaret's grandson from down the lane appears at the door on some errand. The village is contracting back toward itself as the light contracts. Joan is at the fire now, managing the evening pottage, a lighter version of the noon meal using some of what was left, adding a few more leeks from the 9-year-old's harvest, possibly a piece of cheese that needs eating before it goes further than it should. The fire is the focus of all attention in the gathering darkness. The afternoon light, which has been slowly losing its intensity, is now decisively failing. And with the failing of the light, the demands on the household sharpen, because everything that has to happen before dark has to happen in the next hour. Come with me into that last hour of daylight, because it is the most pressured and most revealing hour of the medieval day, and because what unfolds in it tells you more about this village and these people than any other single moment I could show you. The animals have to be secured. Before we go to the last hour of light, I want to stop and tell you about someone, not because she is exceptional, although she was, not because her story is dramatic, although it is in its own quiet way extraordinary, but because she left behind something that most medieval women did not leave, a record. A detailed, daily, unglamorous, honest record of what this life actually looked like from the inside. Her name was Emma of Beston, and she lived in a manor on the edge of the East Anglian Fens in the early 14th century. She's not famous. She appears in no general history that I have encountered. She comes to us through a set of manorial records and account rolls that have been studied by historians of medieval rural life, and through a diary-like document that appears in the back pages of her household's accounts, a set of brief daily notes in a hand that scholars believe to be a woman's, recording the business of the household in brief, factual, completely unsentimental terms. I want to be clear about what we know and what we infer because I think honesty about the limits of the historical record matters here. The document exists, the daily entries exist. Their attribution to Emma is probable but not certain. What is certain is that someone, almost certainly a woman given the subject matter and the household context, was recording the domestic life of this particular holding through a period spanning at least 5 years. Let me tell you what the record shows. Emma, and I will call her Emma, because the evidence points strongly enough in her direction that the name feels right, woke before dawn, as Joan woke before dawn, and the first entry of almost every day noted the state of the household, who was sick, whether any animal was ailing, what the weather was doing. This last item, the weather there, was not casual. The state of the weather determined everything about what was possible on a given day. Rain meant the fieldwork paused or slowed. Frost meant the garden needed covering. Snow meant the road to the market was impassable. The livestock needed more fodder. The wood supply needed calculating. Emma kept track of everything. The number of eggs gathered each day, the quantity of grain sent to the mill and the quantity of flour returned, the amounts of various commodities purchased at market, the prices paid, the names of the sellers, the medical preparations made when household members were ill, the specific tasks completed by the servants, the transactions with the outside world. She also recorded, and this is the part that I find most moving, the small failures, the loaf that did not rise, the animal that was found sick in the morning without any prior sign, the day the mill was not running and she had to wait, the entry that simply says, heavy rain, nothing done outside, not a complaint exactly. The tone throughout is so matter-of-fact that it is sometimes difficult to read emotion into it, but not nothing either. The act of writing it down, of putting the failure into the record alongside the successes, suggests a quality of attention that goes beyond mere bookkeeping. Historians studying Emma's record have been struck by its accuracy, where it can be checked against other documentation, the manorial accounts, the records of market transactions, the court rolls. It consistently matches. Emma was not an unreliable narrator. She was recording what actually happened in the terms she had available, without embellishment and without self-promotion. What the record shows, cumulatively across 5 years, is what the medieval domestic life actually cost. Not in money, though the money is there too, carefully tallied, but in time and attention, and the constant negotiation between what was needed and what was possible. There are entries that record several consecutive days of particular intensity, the harvest period, the pig killing season, the point in late winter when the stored food ran low, and creative management of the remaining supplies became urgent. There are entries that record illness in the household and the specific remedies applied and whether they worked. There are entries that record the death of an animal, the acquisition of a new one, the transaction involved, the calculation of what had been lost and what could replace it. What there are almost no entries about is rest. Over 5 years of daily recording, the moments that Emma marks as ones of genuine leisure, an afternoon with no obligation, an evening spent without work, are so rare that when they occur, they are notable. A feast day that actually was a day without working. A Sunday morning that was not immediately followed by an afternoon task. These stand out precisely because they are exceptional. The ordinary day had no such space in it. The ordinary day was fully occupied from before dawn to after dark, and the recording of it took whatever minutes were left after everything else was finished, written by firelight or candlelight into the margins of the household accounts, in a hand that is sometimes steady and sometimes clearly tired. I find this record almost unbearably honest, not tragic. I want to be careful not to impose a modern emotional vocabulary onto a medieval experience. Emma does not appear to have experienced her life as a tragedy. The tone is too matter-of-fact, too practical, too immediate for that reading. But it is a complete account. It is what the life actually was, written down by the person living it in the terms that seemed relevant to her, which are almost entirely practical and almost entirely concerned with the maintenance of the household and its relationship to the world outside it. The historian who spent the most time with this document, I will not name her here because the attribution of the document is still a matter of scholarly discussion, and I do not want to misrepresent the state of the evidence, wrote that what struck her most, after years of reading it, was not any single entry but the cumulative effect of the whole, the same tasks appearing season after season, the same calculations being made, the same decisions being faced, not because nothing changed. Things changed, people got sick and recovered or did not, animals died, seasons shifted, the household's fortunes rose and fell slightly with the grain prices and the weather. But the structure of the days, the fundamental shape of the obligation remained constant. The fire had to be tended, the household had to be fed, the textile production had to continue, the accounts had to be kept. These things did not stop. They came back around year after year, and Emma met them year after year and wrote them down. There is something in this that I've been thinking about throughout this whole day we have been spending in the medieval village, and I want to try to say it clearly. The medieval woman's labour was relentless, not because her individual situation was unusually difficult, but because the structure of the world she inhabited required relentlessness. The world was not designed to give her rest. The demands of the household did not arrange themselves to leave her spaces of non-demand. The light and the dark and the seasons and the livestock and the food needs of the people she was responsible for, none of these took a day off, which meant she did not take a day off either. And she, Emma, Joan, Margaret, all of them, understood this so completely, so bone deep, that it did not seem like a thing that needed noting. You did not record that the fire needed tending any more than you recorded that breathing was required. It was simply what life was. It simply went on. Emma's record ends mid-sentence in one of its later years. We do not know why. She may have died. She may have become too ill to write. The household may have moved or been broken up, or passed to someone who did not keep records in this way. The document simply stops. I find something quietly heartbreaking about that, and something quietly right about it too. The record ends as life ends, not with a conclusion, not with a summary, not with anything that wraps the whole thing up into meaning, just the last sentence, and then blank pages, and then whoever came after. But what she wrote is still there, and what she wrote shows us, honestly and in detail, what this life was. Come back with me now to the household. The light outside is failing. The last hour of the day has arrived, and there is still work to do. The fire is the brightest thing in the room now. Outside, the October evening has arrived with its particular finality, not the gradual fading of a summer evening, which gives you time to adjust, time to feel the day still present even as the light goes, but the sharp, decisive darkening of autumn, where 1 hour it is afternoon and the next it is night, and the transition between them is brief and unambiguous. Inside, the children are beginning to show the particular signals of the end of the day. The 4-year-old has been on the edge of sleep for the past hour, slipping in and out of it in that boneless, irresistible way that young children have, finally succumbing on the bench near the fire and needing to be transferred to the sleeping pallet without waking. The 9-year-old is quieter than the morning, the energy of the day visibly depleted. The 12-year-old, who would resist the designation of tired on principle, is nonetheless sitting rather than moving, which for him is the same thing. Bedtime in the medieval village was not an event with a fixed time and a ritual sequence. It was more of a drift, a gradual darkening and quieting and lowering of activity as the fire banked down and the light faded and the household's energy simply ran out. The official signal was darkness. When the light was gone, you went to sleep, because there was nothing else to do, and every hour of candle or lamp oil you burned staying awake was an hour of resource spent that could not be unspent. But before the children slept, and this is the moment I want to stay with, because it reveals something important about how this world understood childhood and faith, and the particular fears of the dark, there was prayer. The medieval church's relationship with children was not what we might now call gentle. The theological framework within which medieval children were raised held that human beings were born in original sin, that the life of the soul was a matter of urgent and constant attention, and that the cultivation of piety in children was not a nice-to-have but the primary obligation of the household toward its youngest members. The prayers said by children at bedtime were not sweet lullabies in a religious key, they were serious. The Paternoster, the Lord's Prayer, was the foundational prayer that every Christian was expected to know by heart, and children in medieval England were taught it first in Latin, then in the vernacular. The Ave Maria, the Creed. These were not special occasion prayers. They were the daily minimum, recited morning and night, the skeleton of a Christian life maintained through their constant repetition. But beneath the formal prayers, something else was happening in the moment when the children went to sleep in a medieval village house. Something that I think is not entirely unlike what happens in bedtime for children in any era, which is the confrontation with the dark. The dark in the medieval village was complete in a way that is very difficult to imagine today. Step outside the door of this house on a cloudy October night, with the fire inside banked and the nearest village another mile away, and the darkness is physical. It presses. It has weight, in the way that silence has weight. There is nothing. No ambient light from a distant town. No street light. No window lit by electricity. Nothing. Just the dark and whatever the dark contains. Medieval children were not shielded from the fact that the dark might contain things. The cosmology of the medieval world was populated with real supernatural presences, good and bad, and the night was specifically the time when the bad ones had more freedom. Demons in the medieval theological framework were not metaphors. They were real beings, real enemies of the human soul, active and purposeful. The prayers at bedtime were not symbolic gestures, they were armour. The child who crossed herself and said the Paternoster before sleep was doing something that her community genuinely believed protected her. The blessing of the house at certain seasons, holy water sprinkled in the corners, prayers said over the threshold, was performed with the same earnest practicality that one might now apply to checking the locks. The supernatural was not a decorative addition to medieval experience, it was part of the world's furniture. What did the children of this village hear about the night from the adults around them? They heard about the spirits of the dead, who in the medieval tradition were not cleanly departed to their eternal destination, but sometimes remained, for reasons that required spiritual management, among the living. They heard about the particular dangers of certain nights. Halloween, which was All Saints' Eve, the night before the Feast of All the Holy Dead, was specifically a time when the boundary between the living and the dead was understood to be thinner. They heard about the consequences of pride and carelessness, and the ways that a person could come to harm by failing to maintain the proper relationship with God and with the Church. None of this was told to children to be cruel. It was told because it was believed, and because the adults telling it genuinely felt that a child who understood the real nature of the night was safer than a child who did not. The knowledge was a form of protection. There is a lullaby tradition in medieval England, fragments of which have survived in manuscripts and collections, that is worth pausing over because it reveals something tender about how adults in this world actually related to children's sleep. The medieval lullaby, lully, lullae, the repeated sound that mimics the motion of rocking, older than any language that contains it, was sung to children to draw them down towards sleep, and its content varied between the soothing and the genuinely melancholy. Some medieval lullabies addressed the Christ child, framing the human child's sleep within the story of the divine child's birth. Others were straightforwardly about the difficulty of the mother's life, sung to the baby as a form of private expression, the adult speaking the truth about her exhaustion to the one person who could hear it without judgment. There is something in this tradition, the honest lullaby, the one that did not pretend everything was fine, that I find genuinely moving. It suggests that even within the formal piety of the medieval household, within the theological framework of sin and salvation, and the earnest night prayers, there was space for a kind of honest emotional intimacy between mothers and children that no theology required, but that simply was, because it was human, and because the mother was human, and because the child in arms was the one thing in the medieval household that asked for nothing but to be held. The 4-year-old is deeply asleep now, face slack and serious with it, the breathing slow and even. The 9-year-old is almost there, eyelids heavy, the world receding. The 12-year-old, who would die before admitting he was going to sleep as early as his younger siblings, is sitting against the wall watching the fire with the unseen gaze of someone who is most of the way to unconscious, and does not yet know it. Joan tucks the pallet around the children with the automatic competence of someone who has done this in various configurations for 12 years. She checks the fire. She checks the 4-year-old again. She goes back to her work. Because the children sleeping did not mean Joan's evening was done, not even close. The children going to sleep was simply the removal of one layer of the evening's demands, revealing the layers underneath, the spinning that needed doing, the mending that had been waiting since morning, the accounts in her head, the mental tallying of stores and what remained and what would be needed and when, that were always running somewhere beneath the surface of everything else. The evening's work, the invisible hours. Come with me now into those hours, because what happened in the medieval village household after the children were asleep is a story that is entirely its own, and it is the story of where this day was really lived. Settle in. The fire is lower now, burning at its evening level. Not the big hot fire of the cooking hours, but the steady, patient glow of a fire that is maintaining warmth rather than generating heat for a specific purpose. The room has that particular quality of a space that has been lived in all day, warm from the fire and from the bodies that have occupied it, carrying the layered smell of everything the day contained. It is, if you can hold the unfamiliar parts of it lightly, a not unpleasant smell. It is the smell of habitation, of a place that is genuinely lived in. The children are asleep. William is sitting near the fire, which is his established place in the evening, the seat that, by unspoken household agreement, is his. He has a piece of harnessed leather in his hands, or a tool that needs sharpening, or simply nothing, because a man who has walked 10 miles behind a plough has earned the right to sit for a while with nothing in his hands. He may be talking to Joan, exchanging the day's information in the low murmur of a conversation that is not quite important enough to be a proper conversation, but that is not nothing either. He may be quiet. Joan is spinning. This is the centre of the medieval evening, not as drama, not as anything remarkable, but as the steady, reliable fact of it. The drop spindle turning, the thread drawing out, the fire burning, the room quiet except for the small sounds of the household at rest and at work simultaneously. What else happens in this hour and the hour after? Let me take you through the actual evening life of the medieval village household, because it is both richer and quieter than either the romantic or the grimly austere version we tend to imagine. Stories. The medieval evening was a time for stories in a way that has no real modern equivalent. Not television, not podcasts, not novels read alone in private. Stories told aloud, in the room, by someone to everyone present. The storytelling tradition of the medieval period was oral and communal, and the stories that circulated through it were not a separate category of fiction safely marked off from reality. They were continuous with the world. Accounts of saints' miracles which were told and retold and believed. Stories of local events, the thing that happened at the mill last winter, the strange sight 3 men saw on the road to the market, the family in the next village whose cow gave milk that curdled inexplicably. Stories from the Bible, retold in the vernacular, in the vivid immediate language of people who had heard them at church and brought them home and made them their own. Stories that had been travelling through oral tradition for so long that their origins were unrecoverable and their contents had become part of the landscape. The person who told stories well in the medieval village had a genuine social gift, recognised and valued. A good storyteller made the evening go faster. A good storyteller kept the household together in the firelit circle, when cold or darkness or weariness might otherwise have pulled everyone towards separate silence. The evening gathering around the fire was not only physical warmth, it was the original meaning of community, people with a story in common, telling it to each other in the dark. On certain evenings, depending on the season and the household's relationships, other people came in. A neighbour, a relative, a travelling tradesperson who needed shelter for the night. The medieval household was not as sealed as the modern one. The threshold was crossed more easily in both directions. Visitors came without the elaborate scheduling that modern social life requires. They appeared, they were welcomed or not, they were given whatever food and warmth was available, they added their voices to the evening. This constant permeability of the medieval household, the way the boundary between inside and outside, between the family and the village, was permeable and regularly crossed, is one of the things that most distinguishes medieval domestic life from modern. We live behind closed and locked doors in sealed environments, and we interact with our neighbours through calendars and invitations. The medieval house was open in a way that we have systematically withdrawn from, and with that withdrawal we have gained privacy and lost something else, some quality of involuntary community, of being embedded in the social life of a place rather than maintaining it at arm's length. What about music? Because music was present in the medieval village evening, and it was present in a form that I find genuinely fascinating. Not the elaborate polyphony of the cathedral choirs, not the complex secular music of the courtly tradition. Village music was simpler, older, more immediate. It was danced to as often as listened to. It was sung rather than played as often as the reverse. It was the music that belonged to everyone because no one owned it, that lived in people rather than on pages, that had been passed down through singing and playing rather than through notation. The fiddle, an ancestor of the modern violin, smaller, strung with gut, played on the shoulder or across the lap depending on the tradition, was the instrument of the medieval village. The bagpipe in certain regions, hand drums, tabors, struck or shaken, the recorder and its relatives for those with the skill. These instruments appeared at village gatherings, at harvest celebrations, at the ale houses that existed in most medieval English villages as a venue for the community's social life, and they appeared at home in the evenings when someone had the energy and the inclination. I want to say something about the alehouse, because it is a piece of the medieval village evening that is easy to overlook, and that was genuinely important in ways that go beyond drinking. The alehouse, the alewife's house, the house of whatever woman in the village was currently brewing and selling ale to her neighbours, was the social hub of the medieval village in a way that had no gender distinction. Men and women both went to the alehouse. The custom that drinking establishments were primarily male spaces developed later. In the medieval village, the alehouse was simply a warm room in someone's house, where ale was available and company was present, and both of those things were valued by everyone. The alehouse was where village news circulated, where disputes were begun and sometimes resolved, where the community's stories were told and retold, sharpened by the audience, changed with each telling, where the young people of the village found each other, under circumstances that the community could observe and therefore manage. It was not a den of vice, it was an extension of the household, just larger and more public, and the social life that happened in it was the village's social life, continuous with the social life of the home. William may go to the alehouse on some evenings, Joan, managing the household, less often, but she knows what happens there, because the whole village knows what happens there, because the alehouse is not private in the way that modern social venues are private. Let me come back to the household, because the evening is moving on, and there is one more piece of it I want to show you before we get to the last hour. The candle. If the household has a candle burning, which on an ordinary weekday evening it might, it is a single candle. I want you to hold that in your mind, one flame, probably tallow, burning with the particular flickering light of animal fat, smoking slightly, requiring occasional attention to trim the wick so it does not gutter and waste itself. The light of this single candle, supplemented by the fire, is what Joan is sewing by. Not well, not easily. Medieval needlework done by candlelight was a challenge, and the close work of mending and embroidery done by wealthy women in illuminated manuscript images looks very different from the functional mending done by a village woman in the actual conditions of a tallow candle on a Tuesday evening. She can see enough. She sews by feel as much as by sight. Her fingers know the work. Here is what I find moving about this image. The candle that is burning right now in Joan's house was rendered from the fat of an animal that she or William slaughtered. The wick was twisted from linen thread that she or someone like her spun. The making of the candle was itself a day's labour, done in autumn, producing enough candles to last the household through the dark months, carried out in the smell of rendering fat, in the tedium of dipping and redipping. And now the candle is being burned to give her light to do more work. The labour that produced the light is being spent in the service of more labour. There is something in that circle that is both quietly exhausting and quietly dignified. William is asleep in his chair, not theatrically. He has simply drifted off, the way people do when they are genuinely tired, and the warmth of the fire is sufficient and the evening has gone quiet around them. He will wake in a few minutes, disoriented for a moment, and then go to bed. His sleep, when he gets there, will be deep and complete in the way that physical exhaustion produces. Joan's evening is not complete. It will not be complete for at least another hour. But the quality of this hour, particular texture of sitting in the firelit room after the household has settled, the spinning continuing, the night outside pressing against the door, the village quiet except for whatever sound carries over the distance from the alehouse down the lane, the fire the only light and the fire the only warmth. This is the hour I want to leave you with for a moment. Because in this hour, stripped of every urgency except the work of the hands and the quiet of the house, there is something that is not quite peace but is adjacent to it, a settling, a belonging to the place and the hour, a sense that the day has been inhabited fully, that every hour of it was used, that nothing was wasted, and that the night now arriving is something that has been earned. Come with me into the last hours, because there is still one more thing we need to face before this day is done. It is late. The fire has been banked, the embers raked together, covered with a careful layer of ash, protected through the night in the way we talked about all those hours ago, when this day was just beginning. The candle is out. The room is lit only by what faint orange glow comes from the banked coals, enough to see shapes, not enough to see clearly. The household is mostly asleep. And then, a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not a cry, not a crash, not any of the sounds that announce an emergency with unmistakable clarity. Just a cough, a particular kind of cough, the kind that a mother's body recognizes before the mind has fully processed it, the kind that has something in it, a depth or a wetness or a persistence, that is different from the ordinary clearing cough of sleep. Joan is already awake. This is the moment I want to sit with, because it is perhaps the most intimate and most revealing moment in the medieval domestic day. Everything else we have looked at, the bread, the field, the table, the prayers, all of it happens in the context of the household running as it should, functioning as it was designed to function. But this moment, the sick child in the night, the mother awake before the fire has revived, the dark outside absolute and the village asleep and no one available but her, this is where the medieval household showed its most essential character. Let me tell you what she has. She has her knowledge, built through decades of observation. She knows what a fever looks like and what a fever that is likely to pass looks like, and what a fever that might not pass looks like. She knows what a croup cough sounds like, versus a chest cough versus a throat cough. She knows what the colour of a child's face in firelight tells her about the severity of what is happening. None of this knowledge was given to her by a physician. It was given to her by her mother and by her own long watching, and by the collective accumulated wisdom of the women of this village who had been managing illness in these circumstances for generations. She has her herbs, the bundles hanging from the rafters, the crocks in the corner, thyme, which she knows to steep in hot water for a cough, elderflower, dried, for a fever. It promotes sweating, which in the medical understanding of her tradition indicates the body working to expel the illness. Chamomile, calming, good for a stomach that is cramped with illness. Honey, if there is honey, which is both soothing and genuinely antibacterially active in ways that medieval people understood empirically without knowing the biochemical mechanism. Garlic, strongly medicinal and widely used. She does not have any understanding of bacteria or viruses, any germ theory, any antibiotics, any instrument to measure temperature precisely, any way to summon help before morning. No way, if this turns very serious, to do anything except apply everything she knows and wait and pray. The child with the cough is the 9-year-old. Joan sits beside her on the pallet, one hand on the child's forehead, reading the heat there with the skin of her palm, which is more sensitive than she knows to tiny temperature differences. The heat is real. There is fever here. She's calculating how much fever, what kind, what else she sees in the child's face and breathing and the way she's lying. She gets up and tends the fire back to life. This is the first thing, because what comes next requires heat and hot water. The fire responds to her. The coals were well banked, alive under the ash, and within a few minutes she has a small flame and then a larger one, and the room shifts from orange dark to something with actual light in it. She steeps thyme in the small pot of water she kept by the embers. She adds honey. She waits for it to be warm enough to help but not so hot as to hurt. She brings it to the child, gets her upright enough to drink. The child is half conscious, the particular heavy drowsiness of fever, and drinks without fully waking. This scene, the woman alone in the firelit room in the middle of the night, tending a sick child with hot herbal tea and the full extent of her competence and love, was the medieval version of the emergency room. It was the only version available. The nearest physician, and as we have noted, physicians in rural England in the medieval period were extremely rare and extremely expensive, was not an option. The nearest monastery, which might have more elaborate medical knowledge, was for most villages too far to reach in the night. The priest was for spiritual matters. The midwife herbalist figure, like Margaret down the lane, was the medical practitioner most likely to be called. But calling her in the middle of the night required waking someone to fetch her, which required a level of alarm that Joan has not yet reached. She is managing this. She believes she can manage this. And her confidence in that belief is based on everything she has seen and done in this village, every child she has nursed through fever, every application of thyme tea and elderflower, and the patient sitting through the night that preceded a child waking improved in the morning. The night is long. This is the thing that is difficult to convey about illness vigils before modern medicine. The modern parent calls the nurse line, receives guidance, and either acts on it or takes the child to the emergency department. The waiting, if there is waiting, is not entirely alone. There is infrastructure. There are people on the other end of the phone. There is the knowledge that if things get worse, there is a next step. Joan has no next step, or rather her next step is more thyme tea and a closer watch and prayer in the morning, which will tell her what it will tell her. She sits. The fire burns. The child's breathing is audible in the room, slightly ragged with the cough. Not ominous, but not easy either. Joan's hands are warm in her lap. She's not panicking. Panic is not available to her, not because she's not afraid, but because the situation does not permit it. Someone has to sit here and watch and manage and be steady, and she is the only someone there is. I want to say something honest here, because I have been thinking about this moment throughout this whole day, this particular quality of medieval parental vigilance in the night, and I want to be careful about how I name it. It is not admirable in a romantic sense. It is not beautiful. It is frightening and exhausting and lonely in a way that the word lonely does not quite cover, because the loneliness here is the loneliness of being the only resource, of knowing that your competence and your attention are all that stands between the child and whatever the illness means to do. That is a specific kind of lonely. It is not the same as being alone. But there is something in it, in the quality of attention that it requires, in the specific fullness of presence that happens when you're the only resource and you know it, that is worth noticing. Joan is completely here, in this room, with this child, with the fire and the time tea and her knowledge. She is not distracted. She cannot be distracted. The situation does not permit distraction. And there is a way in which this total presence, forced by necessity, has a quality to it that I think we rarely experience in our medicated, networked, referred to specialist world. We are more safe than she was. Our children are more safe than her children were. The child with a fever tonight will see a paediatrician tomorrow morning if needed, will receive antibiotics if antibiotics are what the bacteria requires, will be taken to a hospital if the hospital is what is needed. These are gifts beyond calculation. I am not proposing we trade them back. But the quality of attention that the night requires of Joan, the complete, undistractable, utterly present attention of the only available medical authority for a child who is sick in the dark, this is something that our safety and our infrastructure have partly relieved us of, and the relief is real and good, and something has also changed in how we are required to be present to the people we love. The child's breathing is easier by 2 a.m. The fever has not broken, it may not break until tomorrow or the day after, but it has reached a plateau rather than continuing to climb, which is a good sign. Joan knows this sign. She has seen it before. She allows herself to settle slightly, the tension in her shoulders dropping a degree or two. She will stay up until dawn. She will not go back to sleep. This is the decision she's already made without making it, the way that certain decisions in life are made below the threshold of deliberation. You simply find yourself doing the thing because not doing it was never a real option. The fire burns, the room is warm, outside the village is completely dark, completely silent, the October night pressing against the walls of the house with no particular malice and no particular mercy, simply there. Joan refills the small pot with water and hangs it back over the fire for another batch of time tea. She tucks the blanket more securely around the child. She settles back into her place beside the pallet. And she waits for the morning. We have been inside this day for a long time now. We began before dawn, with the grey light around the door and the first stirring of the household toward the demands of the world. We watched William walk to the field, and Joan tend the fire and the bread rise in the trough, and the animals be seen to, and the village manage its collective knowledge and its shared resources and its intricate social order. We sat at the table and understood the hierarchy of the seating and the theology of the grace. We followed the afternoon into the garden and the spinning room and the long invisible labour of the domestic hours. We met Emma, who wrote it down, and whose record shows us, honest and unembellished, what the life actually cost. We put the children to bed with their prayers. We sat with the evening's stories and music and the single candle burning in the warm room, and now we are here, in the long night, with Joan beside the sick child and the fire burning low and the village sleeping. Let me step back for a moment the way you step back from a painting to see the whole of it. What has this day shown us? Not a paradise. I want to be clear about that. The medieval village was not the peaceful idyll of certain romantic imaginings, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not spent time with the real historical record. It was physically demanding beyond anything that the vast majority of modern people will ever experience. It was constrained by social hierarchies that we have, rightly, dismantled. Its medicine was largely ineffective and sometimes actively harmful. Its understanding of the natural world was in many respects profoundly mistaken. Its treatment of women was systematically unjust, not occasionally and incidentally, but structurally and deliberately, at every level from the household to the law. Its understanding of children was, by our standards, brutal in its theology and its practice. I am not proposing that we go back. and I am not proposing that the people who lived this life were secretly happier than we are, or secretly wiser, or secretly in possession of some truth that we have lost. These are romantic projections that do no justice to the reality of their experience. But here is what I think this day has shown us, and I want to say it as clearly as I can. It has shown us people in full possession of their lives, not in the sense that they controlled their circumstances, or they did not. They were at the mercy of weather and harvest and illness and the decisions of lords and the will of God in ways that we are almost entirely not. But in the sense that the life they were living was not at one remove from them, was not mediated through screens or abstractions or institutional systems that handled the difficult parts on their behalf. The bread that Joan made was bread that she understood, from the grain to the loaf, in every step of its production. The illness that she's sitting with tonight is an illness she is personally managing, with the full extent of her knowledge, without referral to anyone else. The day that William has lived was lived in his body, through his hands, in his land, in his village. The texture of their experience was immediate in a way that ours very often is not. There is something about immediacy, about being in direct contact with the actual substance of your life, that the medieval village had in abundance, and that we have significantly traded away in exchange for safety and comfort and convenience. The trade was worth making, I believe that completely. But knowing that a trade was made is different from pretending it was costless. What we gained. Our children do not die at the rates that medieval children died. Our bodies do not wear out at 30 from the kind of labour that wore out medieval bodies. Our women are not legally invisible. Our understanding of the natural world has given us medicines and technologies that are, in any honest comparison, miracles. We gained enormous, precious, irreversible things. What we traded. Something about the directness of experience. Something about the knowledge of where things come from. Something about the quality of presence that comes from being the only resource available, the only person who can do this thing, in this place, in this moment. Something about the texture of an evening that had no option but to be fully inhabited. I'm sitting with Joan in the dark of her house in the medieval village, and I find that I'm not sorry for her in the simple sense. She's not a victim of her circumstances. She's a person fully engaged in the life she has, managing it with intelligence and competence and love, doing what the night requires because the night requires it, and she is the person who is there. The fire is burning low, the child's breathing is steady now, dawn is still an hour away. Joan will sit here until the light comes, she always does. The village outside is completely silent. The October night has reached its deepest hour, the hour before the first grey begins at the edges of the sky, the hour when the dark is most absolute and the silence most complete. No wind, no animal sound from the pens, the village as still as it will ever be. Inside this house the fire breathes, the child sleeps, fever still present but not climbing. Joan sits with her hands in her lap, her eyes on the child's face, her attention complete and unreserved. The room is warm, outside it is cold. Somewhere in the village a dog shifts in its sleep, a cow turns in its stall. The thatch settles slightly, the old straw settling in the October cold. And then, at the edge of the eastern sky, just the very edge, just the faintest suggestion of a difference between the dark and the dark, the grey begins. Dawn is coming. The fire needs to be built up again. The household needs to wake and eat and begin. The field is waiting. The bread will need to be started. The child's fever will need to be checked in the morning light, and if it has not broken, more decisions will need to be made. But not yet. For this one moment, between the last of the night and the first of the day, there is only the fire and the room, and the child sleeping and Joan watching, and the grey growing slowly at the edge of the sky. The day is done, another one is coming. That is what the medieval village knew that we have perhaps half forgotten, that this is the shape of it. The day ends and another comes. The fire goes out and is lit again. The bread is eaten and made again. The sick are tended through the night and watched for by the morning. The work is done and the same work comes back around. And in that continuity, in the returning of the same demands, the same fire, the same morning, there is something that is not quite comfort but is close to it. The persistence of the ordinary, the reliability of the day coming back. Joan stands slowly and goes to the hearth. She pushes the curfew aside, the coals are alive underneath the ash, orange and patient exactly as she left them. She kneels and breathes on them gently. The fire catches. The day begins. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us keep making more content. I'll see you in the next one. What detail from this day in the medieval village surprised you most? Drop it in the comments below.